Hi, everyone. How are you? How's everyone? I'm super excited to be here. I'm Alex. We're talking today about whether or not you should start a podcast in the year 2019 or maybe 2020. I'm excited to be here. Thank you to the whole Carnage team, to Nick and Adam for making this happen. It seems like a really fun event so far. So basically, should you start a podcast? I know this is like top of mind for so many people, and being kind of like in the podcast industry, I know that it seems like everyone wants to start a podcast, but we're really trying to figure out today whether it's right for you. And today we're really focusing on this in terms of using podcasts as a marketing tool. So we're not really talking today about like using podcasts as a passion project, which is actually great, and I've done that with a lot of different podcasts. But today we're looking at what we can achieve through podcasting from a marketing perspective. So I'm kind of thinking of this in like two different buckets. So I'm thinking of people who are basically like individuals or people who have small businesses, versus the second bucket that I'm thinking of are like people in the audience here who work at bigger companies. Maybe you're part of the marketing department, maybe you're gonna be pitching a podcast to your boss. Maybe you guys are the boss. I know there are a lot of like bosses and powerful people in here. So maybe that's you guys. So take notes on this too. But basically that's where we're going to be looking at this from those two perspectives. A little bit about me. I don't know where Adam got this picture from somewhere, it's like. But basically I started off, I went to graduate school for journalism, and there I studied radio. I actually had a professor that just said I had a really nice voice for radio, and so I took the class. I never ended up doing anything on mic, so that was kind of a waste. But I'm a producer now, and I run this company, Domino. Prior to working in, basically I started at Minnesota Public Radio. That was my first job in Minnesota. I was doing 3 hours of live radio every single day, which was really crazy, and I'm so happy I never have to do that again. I was working in Minnesota. It was really cold in Minnesota, and I wanted to do the exact opposite, so I moved to Miami and was working in television for a little while at Fusion. When I was working at Fusion, I ended up really missing the whole radio thing, so I basically ended up going back to working in podcasting with Stitcher. And at Stitcher, it's a big podcast company, and I ran the brand studio there. So that was all things branded podcasts. It was producing branded podcasts, kind of doing like high-level production for ads. And during that time is when I met Seth Godin, and you mentioned Seth Godin in the intro. Seth is a good friend and a mentor, and now I produce his podcast, but also teach a class with Seth. And it's a podcasting class. We're going to talk about it a little more later on, but it's a class that teaches you how to make your own podcast. It's a 7-week course. At the end of it, you basically can start your own podcast. You have a podcast published on Apple Podcasts and everywhere else that you can get podcasts. And since then, I also started Domino Sound. I have a colleague, Homero Radway, here in the audience. Shout out Homero for coming to Pittsburgh and joining us here. And so at Domino, we are a production company and also a podcast network. So we do branded podcasts and also do original content. And so some of the takeaways that I want to look at today, it's really hard to see these slides over here. I have to look up here once in a while. We want to talk a little bit about whether podcasting is the right decision for you at this moment. If you're thinking about starting your podcast, we're going to talk about the places and the goals that you need to think about before you actually make that decision. And we want to talk about sponsorship versus branded podcasts, because marketing in podcasts can kind of take two forms. You can either do the traditional advertising, which is kind of like those host-read ads where it's like you might hear like HelloFresh or Casper or all of those different things. There can be an exclusive sponsorship. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about later too. And then there's also branded podcasts. We're going to look at some examples of podcasts that really work from a marketing perspective. And we're also going to figure out how you can actually, let's say like you take that step, after this talk or whatever, you go back home and you decide that this is what you want to do, you want to start a podcast, we can figure out how you're actually going to do that. So, for a little context, I mentioned in the beginning, it seems like everyone wants to start a podcast, and also that's indicative of the fact that people are really listening to podcasts now. There was a 2019 survey that revealed basically half of the American population listens to podcasts. This first statistic, the big blue line, there's 144 million Americans that have listened to a podcast before. So that's a huge number. The more interesting statistic, perhaps, is the second one, and that's 32% of the population, 90 million people, regularly listen to podcasts. And that number has tripled over the past decade. So for advertisers, this is obviously something really interesting. For marketers, it's really interesting. And I think that's a large part of the reason it's such a huge part of kind of like our national discussion right now. I don't know if anyone's seen this. I'm going to play it part of the beginning.
Live from the MeUndies Theater in Portland, it's The Potties. And here are your hosts. From Serial, Sarah Carney. And from New York Times The Daily, Michael Barbaro.
This is SNL.
From Portland, I'm Michael Barbaro. And this is The Potties.
Podcasts are everywhere. Last year, over 3 billion new podcasts were produced. I know, that's a lot.
They're like delicious little whispered documentaries. And tonight is for them. I'm so excited.
And I'm lit. All podcasts need sponsors. And it's up to the hosts to gracefully weave their ads into the show. These next people tried their best to do that.
Here are the nominees for most jarring transition into a sponsor.
The preppy liberal podcast, Bros Save Politics.
Fascism has arrived in America,
yes.
Okay?
Crazy!
And the country is over.
It's done!
Now let's talk about Sherry's berries. Ever want to mail your mom some fruit?
The true crime podcast, I saw it.
Police brought back the bike, but not the boy. Bike, but no boy. Because the boy was dead. Blue Apron. Don't have time to cook? Blue Apron has you covered with meals like zesty pork tacos.
So you guys get the idea. It is really funny. I wanted to play that because it gives me such a kick. Like when I started working in radio and podcasting, it was like this tiny little niche community that was really nerdy and people kind of like make fun of. I mean, people still do, but it's also on everyone's mind now. That quote that there were 3 billion new podcasts obviously was a joke, but there are, and it's growing so intensely. There's now 700,000 new podcasts. And this is a graph that shows essentially the number of new podcasts that come every year. So back in 2006, that little tiny, that looks like it must have been, I don't even know, a couple hundred, a couple thousand. And now this year, there are 700,000 new podcasts. So it does seem like everyone has a podcast. We all have a friend who has a podcast, and we all have our favorite podcast, but should you create one? And that's the question that we're asking today. I think it's really important. So I work, as I mentioned, with Domino Sound. We work with clients to figure out whether a branded podcast or podcasting works for them for their marketing efforts. And the main thing that I always ask people to start with is goal setting. And so you need to figure out what goals you have before you want to start a podcast. So the first one that is a great goal for somebody who wants to start a podcast is if you want to increase brand awareness. And when you have a branded podcast, brand awareness is something it's really effective for increasing brand awareness because it's like a really intimate way you're listening. It's like right in your ear pods. It's somebody that you have a connection with. And so that's a great goal if you want to start a branded podcast. Another good goal, positive association. So this one's really interesting, and actually, as I was kind of preparing this talk, I came across this new research from the BBC. This just came out last week. They did this actual study on the effectiveness of branded podcasts, and they were looking specifically at this positive association with a brand. And they looked at this podcast. They didn't reveal the name of the branded podcast, but it was a branded podcast that used the word innovative 12 times in the podcast. And when they polled people after the podcast, people were more likely to associate the sponsor of that podcast, the brand that did the podcast, with innovation. So this essentially means, when you are associated with a brand, when you have a branded podcast, the words and the kind of content that you're using in that branded podcast, your brand will be associated with, which is really, really powerful and really hard to accomplish from a marketing perspective. Another goal is positioning yourself as a thought leader. And a podcast is a great way to do that because you can I actually didn't even have time to put this in the presentation, but I got a bunch of advertisements for it on the way here. Bank of America has a brand new podcast, and they're interviewing people. They have huge names. Like the first episode is with Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker. And from my perspective, seeing that, that's something where they're trying to position themselves as a thought leader, and this is a really great vehicle for that kind of thing. If you have a story to tell, if your brand or your customers have a story to tell, that's another great opportunity for a branded podcast, because the branded podcast is all about, and a podcast in general, about storytelling. And so one of the podcasts that's a great example of this, of having a story to tell, there's a podcast that Kickstarter did. In the podcast, essentially, each episode, they highlight customers that have a really interesting story that use Kickstarter to start their business. So that not only highlights the customers and tells really interesting stories, but it's obviously good for Kickstarter too. These goals, these last two goals are ones that when I meet with clients, I actually hear a lot. And these are ones that aren't necessarily conducive to podcast marketing, especially a branded podcast. So if you want to do a 30-minute ad for your business or product, don't do a branded podcast. I know that sounds obvious, but there are a lot of people I talk to where it's like we go over all these ideas for the podcast, and in the end, all they really want is like an extension of their 1-minute digital ad. And that doesn't really work. It has to be something that's like a lighter touch, and you have to be a little more experimental with it. So, and the next goal that I see from a lot of clients as well is having immediate direct response results. And that's the kind of thing that we were talking about that ad just made fun of, or the SNL skit made fun of like HelloFresh. You go to like Pod Save America /HelloFresh or whatever it is, you get the code, and you do some kind of like direct response marketing. A branded podcast isn't necessarily effective for that either, and we'll get into a little bit more later why, but these are kind of like taking stock of what you want to do before you start this podcast is really important. So writing down, you can even like write it down if you're an individual or you're a company, you can write down the goals and then kind of figure out where you land on that. So the first option, basically, and this is for the people who I'm talking about who are building a personal brand, or if you have a small business, is a DIY podcast. And I was talking about this with the Carnage team a little bit, and they have a podcast. It's called Do the Hard Thing, right? Do the Hard Thing. And it's not necessarily DIY, but it's one of the things where you kind of do it with the people in your company, and you're not necessarily spending $1 million on the budget. And this is really effective for individuals and for small businesses. And this is something that really everyone can do. And it's a really, like, as opposed to television, it's a low barrier to entry. It's not easy to do a podcast, but money-wise and time-wise, it's much easier than doing a lot of different kinds of media. So a DIY podcast, this is Seth Godin. This is how he was kind of advertising the podcast fellowship. I need to step down so I can read this actually to you guys. This was a really interesting framing. So this is what he posted on his blog when we were talking about the podcast fellowship that I teach with him. And this was kind of in order to sign up students. And this was how he was framing it. So that podcasting is the new blogging. Not as a way to make big dollars, blogging didn't do that either, but as a way to share your ideas, to lead your community, to earn trust. Podcasting is a proven technology that's still in its infancy. It's an open mic, a chance for people with something to say to find a few people, or perhaps more than a few, who'd like to hear them say it. And podcasting is the generous act of showing up, earning trust and authority because you care enough to raise your hand and speak up. So this framing is really perfect to me because these are the exact reasons that you would start a DIY podcast. To build trust, to build a community, and if you have something to say, to raise your hand and go ahead and say it. And that is really effective in kind of building this community that we're talking about. An example of this, the Investor Mindset podcast, this was actually started by a student from Seth's and my class. And this is somebody who, when he started the podcast fellowship, he had absolutely no following. He put it this way, he had no influence, no following, and he had never picked up a microphone before or done anything at all like this. After 7 weeks, he had started this podcast called the Investor Mindset podcast. And I actually also, in preparation for this conversation, spoke with him about kind of his process behind this. And he was telling me when he signed up for the podcast fellowship, he had a few goals in mind for his podcast. And these goals, he put it like this, the 4 C's. So the 4 C's, connection, that's connecting with guests you might otherwise not have an opportunity to speak with. I think this is super important to think about with a DIY podcast, especially if you're, as I was saying, an individual with a personal brand. It's really a way, and I've done this with my podcast too. I produce a bunch of different podcasts, passion projects, marketing, whatnot. And And my students are always surprised by this too. If you have somebody that you've always wanted to have a conversation with, either a famous person, an academic, somebody who's like a VP of marketing somewhere, those are the kinds of people that you might want to email and say, you know that email that we all do, like, can I go take you to coffee and pick your brain? And so often that email doesn't work because the people that we want to talk to get a million of those emails. But when you email someone and you say, this is the link to my podcast, I want you to be on the podcast, I really respect your work, there's a really high likelihood that these people are going to respond to you and have a conversation with you. And it's something that my students always talk about because they always think that they're going to be these long shot guests that they'll never be able to get. But people underestimate kind of how much other people enjoy talking about themselves and hearing about their own work and like being praised for their work. So it's kind of like a little bit of it sounds like a like scammy kind of thing. It's not really a scam, but you can actually just use this as an opportunity, as a vehicle to talk with people you wouldn't have the opportunity to. Steve also talks about contribution, so basically making a contribution to your community. And so his in particular, he is the podcast called The Investor Mindset. So his podcast is about tips and tricks and investor. It's a resource for people who are looking to invest. And so that's how he builds the number 3, building a community. And he's told me that his community, he had his little network prior to starting the podcast. But since starting the podcast, he has this really big community that he has been able to capitalize on. So C is capitalize. So this is his other goal in all of this prior to starting the podcast was and this is kind of, I think, what a lot of people have when they start a podcast, this idea that something is going to come out of it. You know, it's like you're going to start this podcast and you don't know exactly what's going to happen in a year or 2 years, but something good is going to come of it. And in so many cases, that's actually true. And so Steve, the host of this podcast, what he's done has used the success of the podcast to start this whole new business, essentially. So he has his real estate business, and it's grown because of the podcast and because of that reach. But he also now does this series of live events and talks, and he charges people to attend. So that's like a whole new revenue stream, and that also builds his community too. So these are the statistics and numbers on Steve's podcast. I want to show you these because this is what's possible. This isn't necessarily the norm. I wouldn't say that like anyone who launches a podcast ends up with these results, but this is something that's completely possible. I mean, after 1 month, he had 20,000 downloads. After the first few months, he had 40,000 downloads, and he was on all of these lists, all of these best podcast lists. So again, that's not necessarily the norm, but just so you can have a sense of really what's possible when you do your own podcast. The next, sorry, I skipped ahead. How can you do this? So if you come away from this and you say, I want to do my own podcast, there are a lot of different ways that you can do it. The Podcasting Fellowship, this is the one that I mentioned with Seth and I. It's a 7-week course. You learn kind of all of the technical skills. You learn what equipment to get, you learn how to interview guests, and you learn how to really make a podcast. And at the end of that course, every single person in the class, well, if they didn't like fall behind or whatever, have a podcast at the end of those 7 weeks. And there's still a really long period of growth after that. You don't come out with cereal at the end of 7 weeks, but you come out with something that's like a really good start, and you come out with the skills to be able to continue learning on your own and developing. There are also a lot of other, and I'm sure wherever you guys are from, wherever you live, you can just kind of Google, I've done this before, Google like podcast class and then wherever you are. This is a little screenshot of one that's held in Brooklyn where I live. It's at this place called Union Docs. It's a radio boot camp. But there's a lot of different options like for just kind of short, fast boot camp style classes. Another option, hire a freelance producer. That can be someone, so let's say you want to get into this and you're kind of serious about it, but you don't necessarily have time to learn how to edit yourself. It's also a pretty affordable option to kind of hire somebody who knows how to do it hourly. My email is going to be at the end of this. I have suggestions for freelancers if anyone's interested in that. You can also work with friends who have production savvy. I mean, I'm always surprised when I like tap into my network how many people are either producers or know how to do editing and audio editing. So many of my podcasts have music from my friends in them. Even if you're making the podcast and they can't produce it, hit up your friends and see who of your friends can help you out, maybe give you some free music, be a guest on your podcast. It's really like also a great kind of way to tap into your own network and see who you can collaborate with. So that's been a really fun thing for me in podcasting. The next category, as opposed to DIY podcasts, are branded podcasts. And these are podcasts that are created basically, again, like by companies like Coach and Carbonite. These are big corporations, big companies that have a lot of money to spend on this. Not a lot. I don't want to say a lot, but I do want to emphasize that this requires a budget. I would say anywhere from $50K to like $1 million is a branded podcast budget. So it's really high, and I think a lot of people going into it don't realize that this budget that's what it takes to do it. And a lot of people think that podcasting, I was just having a conversation at lunch before this, people think that podcasting is really easy, like it's like the two guys in a basement talking on their mics and like hitting publish. That's not exactly how it goes, and it does require time, resources, budget, marketing budget. So these are a bunch of headlines that I pulled from recent articles about branded podcasts. I think that this New York Times little subhead captures it really well. It's not surprising, since podcasts are so popular, it's really not surprising that companies are starting them. But what is surprising is that people are listening to them. And I think that's what has surprised a lot of different marketing people, a lot of different people who are looking at this closely. And you can see, again, branded podcasts are the ads people actually want to listen to. Publishers are seeing traction in branded podcasts. And so people are listening, but they're definitely not listening to all of them. There are so many branded podcasts that you have not heard of because they're not good, because they haven't taken the steps to actually make it a good podcast. And so it's really important to realize that all of the elements that go into a good regular podcast are also the things that you need to be thinking about for your branded podcast. And the main one for me that I've found that is a struggle for people is authenticity. So I would definitely keep that in mind if you're thinking about doing a big branded podcast. It's kind of trying to figure out how you can maintain authenticity to your brand. This is cover art of a bunch of different big branded podcasts that are out right now. The Trader Joe's one is a huge hit. That's a great brand for a branded podcast because they have a really dedicated following. People love Trader Joe's. It's a really good store, and they have episodes. The episodes are super insidery. It's like, why are the customers at Trader Joe's? No, why are the cashiers at Trader Joe's so happy? And the podcast is just them kind of going around and interviewing the cashiers. It kind of sounds boring, but if you're a stan of Trader Joe's, then it's a really good thing for you. Dream It Real. This is new from Coach. I listened to it recently. Take a listen. It's basically, they have really big name guests. That's the whole thing of this podcast. Some podcasts are the whole thing is that they have famous people on it. So Dream It Real is the Coach one. They have Michael B. Jordan, Selena Gomez, all of these really famous people. Take a listen and see if you think it works. And then there's also one that I love is this DTR from Gimlet Creative and Tinder. It's a podcast. I don't listen to that many branded podcasts just because I work on them so much and it's saturated in my mind. But DTR is one that I listen to just to enjoy. It's basically you're taken on audio dates with people who are going on different Tinder dates. It's they profile one person and she goes on 3 Tinder dates throughout the episode. It's really entertaining. So again, you want to think about when you're doing this, do you want a brand building tool or do you want a direct response tool? And so for me, I would definitely say that branded podcasts are much better for brand building, and they create a reason for people to talk about your company just beyond the brand or product. And inherently, that is not meant for every brand. So Tinder is such a great example. There's so many stories there. Those customers, they're just so endless, endless stories. And I don't even get tired of hearing them. I have so many friends who talk about their Tinder dates. Everyone has stories. So that's a perfect brand for that, but not every brand is right for that. And I think some of the ones that, I'm not going to even call out the ones that I don't think are right, but it's just not for everybody. And so thinking about this, these are other really, I'm highlighting some of the ones that I think are good. Casting Call from Squarespace is really interesting. But the pros and cons, essentially, you get a positive brand boost. You can use it as a response to bad PR. I didn't realize this until I did a little more research into that McDonald's podcast. But McDonald's released some kind of special sauce. Does anyone know about McDonald's special sauce? They released a special sauce that people really liked, but they didn't release enough of it, and their customers were up in arms about it, and they were furious. And so McDonald's, in response, created this serial-esque 3-episode investigative series to kind of say sorry to their customers, and I guess people really liked it. So you can respond to bad PR. You can also reach people that you might not otherwise reach, so maybe people who are engaging with your digital ads or whatever kind of other marketing you're using. You can reach different people through podcasting, so that's valuable too. And you can, as we were talking about a lot, you can really earn trust and loyalty. And I think that's a really important piece of this. Again, cons, I don't know if it's necessarily cons as much as caveats. You really do need buy-in from the team. You need people on your team who are going to be willing to talk to the producers of the podcast, who are going to be willing to come up with the concepts and basically talk people through it, because it can be a complicated process. This, I think it's just going to play automatically, so I'll have to talk about it after. Maybe not, though. Oh, yeah, there we go.
I felt like I could say whatever I wanted and nobody could hurt me. And that was a time where I would have witnesses if anybody tried to do anything to me. And so I could talk freely because I was on a stage and I had the microphone.
In the early 1990s, Kathleen Hanna went to a lot of punk rock shows where the crowd was a sea of men. And so when she stepped on stage herself as the lead singer of the band Bikini Kill, her goal was to change that audience and to make the whole underground music scene more feminist. Then she got famous and unintentionally became a punk feminist figurehead in a rapidly growing movement known as Riot Grrrl. She knew she'd be threatened by the male-dominated punk scene that she worked so hard to change, but she did not expect to be torn down by other women who identified as feminists. And when Bikini Kill broke up, Kathleen had to decide whether she still wanted to keep making music or whether it would be too painful. I'm Ann Friedman, and this is Going Through It, a show about how hard it can be to figure out when to quit and when to keep going. On this episode,
I don't know how we could
what
stop
happens when
that
you create a
from playing.
supportive, nurturing community?
Perfect, thank you. So I wanted to play that. That's, I think, a really good example, and I know that there was someone from MailChimp here earlier. Shout out for your great branded podcast. I wanted to play that because it's such, you didn't even hear anyone say in that intro, presented by MailChimp, or this is from MailChimp, or like any kind of shout out from MailChimp. All that there really is that little, I guess that's a MailChimp, the little MailChimp in the corner of the cover art. And I think that that's a really great example of this subtle branding that we're talking about with branded podcasts. And you have to just be willing to be able to do that. I need to get into Q&A right now. I went a little too slow, so we're missing just like one little tiny piece, but the Q&A is going to be even better. So, Q&A time? Sure. Let's do it.
Okay. We have a lot of questions for you. So get ready.
That's why I had to cut, because there were a lot of questions. That's probably more important anyway.
No, your talk was great.
Thank you.
All right, let's start out with one that asks, here's another one. What are some of the most innovative ways brands have promoted a podcast or driven listeners to individual episodes?
That's a really good question. The one that I don't know if I would say this is innovative, but as I was saying, I think I was mentioning on the plane ride here, I was on the New York Times, and there was like a New York Times branded content post that was actually promoting that Bank of America podcast. So it was essentially like a branded post on the New York Times that was then an article about the branded podcast that it was one of those branded things that looked like a regular article, but it was actually branded, and that was driving listeners. I think other ways that are innovative are kind of live events. I think that live events can be a really cool way to do it, but this is what I get told over and over, and Homero, who does marketing and sales at Domino, knows this. It's really much more effective, people find, to do the traditional marketing route for these. So the way that people find other podcasts is by advertising them on existing podcasts. So when you're listening to a podcast and they're like, if you like this show, check out like the new podcast from MailChimp. So it's interesting to get into the innovative question of how you can market it, but like in the end, the most effective way to do it is to get that marketing budget and buy ads on other podcasts.
Gotcha.
Sucks, but yeah.
What are the best programs to record your podcast when you're first starting out?
I always recommend that my students use this program called Audacity. It's a free editing software, and it's really effective. You can spend like $75 on a really amazing USB mic that you can plug into your computer, and you record it straight into Audacity, and you can edit in that. And that's where, so for instance, the class that I teach with Seth, most of the software and most of the stuff that we use is actually free and available online. People end up spending money on equipment and stuff, but you can use Audacity. Another really great way to do it is, I use it all the time for meetings, but Zoom You know Zoom? So Zoom, you can basically, if you have a conversation on Zoom, you can have a recording option. And it records, actually, it's almost like meant for podcasting. It records one track. So like if I was interviewing you remotely, it would record your voice on one audio track and my voice on another audio track. And then you can just kind of like edit it together. It's really good.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
All right, so I love this question. What level of scripting goes into your podcasts, or do you suggest an outline and then you just kind of wing it?
That is like, it's completely different based on every single podcast. So for instance, I was just listening to the podcast Mogul from Gimlet. It's about like hip hop legends, and this one I think is focusing on like Miami bass. But that podcast, for instance, there's not really, except for the interviews, there's not a word in that podcast that's not scripted. Like the host is reading a script, and he does an amazing job. It's like really great, but there are a lot of podcasts that are completely scripted. And then some podcasts, there's this podcast I produce called Food for Thought, Food, the number 4, Thought spelled T-H-O-T. And we do, that's like a conversational podcast. So there are 4 hosts, and we do, before every episode, we all get into a Google Doc, for instance, and write kind of like bullet points about what we want to talk about. And the only thing that's scripted in those kinds of conversational podcasts usually will be like the introduction, maybe an introduction to a guest, and kind of like bullet points on what you want to talk about. But a lot of times, it's actually more rare for like for every word to be scripted. But I would definitely recommend kind of like going in with a loose script or an outline, as this person said.
Have you ever seen it where it starts off in one format and that just doesn't seem to be working, so then they flip to the other?
Absolutely. And this has happened on branded podcasts that I've worked on too. And this is like, it's not a good or a bad thing. There are some people who are able to riff more than others. You know what I mean? And it's like, maybe you think that this person is going to be able to be a riffer, and it turns out that they need to be scripted. So, or vice versa. Like, it's like the script is too tight for them, and they end up like going a lot looser, and that ends up being better. So you can definitely, and that's something with all podcasts, you can kind of like change the format, you can change the form, like it's very flexible. So yeah, there are a lot of ones that have changed kind of midway through.
Gotcha. Okay, so what are the best ways to cross-promote your podcasts on different channels, like YouTube videos, sound bites on Instagram, etc.?
I think sound bites on Instagram is really good. I definitely, Food for Thought, the one I just mentioned, a couple of the hosts are like influencer types. So our marketing comes a lot from kind of the followings on Instagram and Twitter. I definitely like the ability to kind of use those like the audio clips on Instagram, I think are really interesting. On other channels, I do see a lot of people, and I'm hoping to get a little more into this too, a lot of people who do their podcast as a YouTube video. And even if it's just like people, I think The Breakfast Club and some of those like morning shows, they are YouTube videos, but they can also be a podcast. So if you get a camera in the studio, it gets a little harder when it comes to like editing probably. Like you would probably just air the podcast in full as a YouTube video and maybe edit down the podcast. But I'm definitely looking a lot at kind of trying to cross-promote on YouTube as well.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is the average frequency of a successful podcast?
That can also depend. I mean, when you're doing a limited series, so something that we're thinking of is similar to TV. So like Serial, for instance, or a lot of those kind of highly produced podcasts, they might be an episode. They might be a season of 12 episodes. Usually, those 12 episodes will release weekly. A lot of times, people are doing like that Netflix binge thing where they drop them all at once. I've worked with audience development teams who have a hard time figuring out which is more effective, really. But another way that's really great to build an audience, especially when we're talking about these DIY podcasts, and I have a friend who works still at Stitcher who's very into audience development, and she highly recommends doing like weekly. She's like, your podcast needs to be out like 52 episodes a year. Like you need one every week. And it's like a lot of ways when you're building an audience, it's about consistency. And so if you do it weekly, that's a really effective way to do it.
So let me ask you this in terms of consistency. Let's say you go all out and you decide, I'm going to do this every single week, and you're just not seeing it generating the type of result that you wanted to. Would you recommend just plowing forward, or you should pull back a little bit?
I probably would say that's not an issue with the frequency, it's probably an issue with the content. So I would definitely recommend, and I have a lot of people, again, like from this class, I have hundreds of students who will hit me up after, a few months, after 6 months, and be like, my content has kind of like plateaued, you know what I mean? And I think either it's a question of figuring out more inventive ways to market it, or maybe taking a closer look at like what you can tighten up or improve in terms of concept.
Gotcha. Okay, so do you believe short podcasts are more effective than long ones?
It's so funny because I'm somebody, it's so sad, my attention span now. It's just like pathetic. But like I can't listen to much more than like 45-minute podcast is like my personal max. But there are so many people, millions and millions of people who listen to 2 hours of Mark Maron or like 3 hours of The Read. You know what I mean? Like The Read, I love The Read. But like 3 hours, but it works for so many people. Like, and so for me, I think it totally depends. And I think there's an audience for all different lengths of podcasts. And I've seen, the 25-minute podcast be just as successful as the 3-hour ones.
Gotcha. Okay, final question. How would you evaluate a request to be on someone's podcast as a guest? Like, what goals might that apply to?
Wait, say it again. So it's somebody somebody has emailed this person and been like, will you be a guest on my podcast?
Hey, you want to be a guest on my podcast? How do you know, like, is this a good idea?
That's a good question. I mean, it's honestly just do some research. Listen to an episode of the podcast. I always kind of like click and see how many reviews they have on iTunes. That's probably not like the best way to do it, especially because that's becoming a little more obsolete now that Spotify is getting heavier in the game. But I would say the main thing is to listen to an episode of the podcast. And since everybody is starting them now, as we talked about, there still will be times, and I get hit sometimes, people will contact me and say, I haven't launched the podcast yet, but will you be a guest? And it's just simply like researching the person who emailed you. You know what I mean? And if it's somebody who like aligns with your values and you think that they're somebody who you respect, then I would be on the podcast. I try and say no to as few of those requests as possible.
Do you really?
Know? Yeah. No, I said that badly. I try and say yes most of the time.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that's nice.
Yeah. I mean, it's usually a good conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alexandra.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. Thank you all for all your questions.
Thank you.